Madrid, Spain, June 1936. Gunshots echo in the distance, but you are so used to that sound by now that you continue your journey to work. It's dangerous to walk the streets of Madrid these days. The various factions are battling in the streets for control, as they do across all of Spain. The whole country is on edge. Law and order is breaking down. Walking past the various newsboys yelling out the headlines, the divisions racking your country are clear. 14 churches burned down and nuns raped by Reds yesterday. Only the army can save Spain, yells one. While another bellows out that martyrs of the people murdered by fascist scum. Only communism can save Spain from fascism. Then you smell burning as you turn a corner and see a church on fire. Anarchists with their red and black flags cheer as the roof collapses and they fire into the air. A priest is on his knees outside, an armed anarchist towering over him. The priest looks up with hate in his eyes and spits out, "Curse the Republic." The anarchist sneers back, raises his gun, and shoots the priest in the head. You flee the gruesome scene, blindly running as fast as you can, until you find yourself in one of the nearby slums. A large crowd is cheering and waving hammer and sickle flags and images of Lenin and Stalin. The Communist Party orator yells out, "I want a republic without class war, but for that, one class has to disappear." As the crowd yells out, "Hang the bourgeoisie, hang the landlords," 3 trucks speed around the corner, filled with men in blue uniforms. Someone screams out, "It's the Falange! The fascists are attacking!" They had machine guns in the back of the trucks that open fire and spray the crowd with lethal waves of lead. As bodies litter the streets and communist guards fire back, you throw yourself to the floor, catching sight of one of the Falangist machine gunners as a truck speeds past. You are struck by how serene he looks, and that he is smiling. A cross hangs around his neck, as if he is doing God's work, gunning down people in the street. With a sick feeling in your stomach, you realize this madness can only end one way: civil war. I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
damals uns ausgebeten. Wollen diese 4 Jahre Nazi.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. This series is something I've been really looking forward to covering: the Spanish Civil War, a prelude to World War II, the first great battle between fascism and communism, or fascism and democracy, depending on your politics. Is a conflict outsiders both at the time and now love to simplify. Spain became a blank canvas for foreigners to paint whatever picture they wanted. The propaganda and fake news hid a very messy and very Spanish war. For those locals actually fighting and dying on the front lines, Republican or nationalist, they knew in their bones this was all part of a much older conflict: the war between the two Spains. The modern Spanish state was formed in the fire of war, the Reconquista. The Iberian Peninsula had been overrun and conquered by the Islamic armies of the Caliphate, but then, slowly, over the centuries, what was left of Christian Spain drove them back, until in 1492 the last Spanish Islamic kingdom at Granada fell. The long struggle had a profound effect on Spanish society. The warrior aristocracy that had won the Reconquista were richly rewarded for their service with conquered lands, becoming so dominant economically that even a pre-revolution French aristocrat would be green with envy. If it was the aristocrats who did the fighting, there was the Catholic Church who integrated those same territories into the Spanish state. It became the main unifying force, chief propagandists, and often the bureaucrats of the new state. For those who didn't toe the line, well, as Monty Python said, no one expects the Spanish Inquisition. Not only was it powerful and heavily linked to the army, it was more traditional than even the Vatican. It completely rejected the modern world. Lastly, the new Spanish nation would be highly centralized around the state that had led the Reconquista, Castile. This was much to the chagrin of border areas in the north, like the Basque Country or Catalonia. This was the first Spain, the so-called Eternal Spain, standing for the Catholic Church, the army, centralized authority, and protecting the social order. At first, this setup seemed to work. Spain became a global superpower with a vast empire. But then, in just 2 generations, decline set in. Spain stagnated and didn't industrialize or modernize. The census of 1788 shows the problem. Almost 50% of the adult male population were not involved in any form of productive work. The army, the church, and above all the vast nobility were a dead weight on the rest of the population. It was perhaps this statistic which provoked the well-known saying that, quote, "One half of Spain eats but does not work, while the other half works but does not eat." End quote. Those who worked but did not eat were the second Spain, the poor peasantry, reformers from the middle class, disaffected regions at the Basque Country, and later urban industrial workers. They stood roughly for cutting the aristocracy and church down to size, modernizing Spain, and handing power back to the regions. To say Spain had a rough 19th century is an understatement. It lost its empire, suffered multiple invasions, rapidly churned through various royal dynasties, briefly became a republic, and suffered countless coups. None of this solved the problem of the 2 Spains. Instead, things got worse. Far worse. By the turn of the 20th century, well over half of Spain went to bed hungry each night. Wages were so low in Galicia that handmade lace could compete with factory products. But the worst off were in the south, where labourers were known as machines of blood. They earned as little as 2 pesetas a day and spent about a third of the year in enforced idleness. They ate as they lived, less well than their masters' donkeys. At Castillo Blanco, desperate men were arrested for gathering acorns, a crop consecrated to pigs. If caught, they were publicly whipped. Near Ciudad Real, famished peasants even fed on grass like human cattle. Life expectancy was around 35 years old, the same as when the Reconquista ended. Literacy was well over 60%. Peasants and tenants had to vote as their landlord told them, or face eviction. Canvassing consisted of the political bosses, the caciques, sending out armed gangs known as the Bludgeon Party. And if that did not look like working, then ballot papers were destroyed or substituted. Political and economic corruption spread from Madrid in a way that far exceeded anything known in previous centuries. The courts were rigged right down to the village tribunals, so no poor person ever expected to have his case heard, let alone obtain justice. Not surprisingly, the peasantry absolutely detested their so-called betters. As one peasant soldier fighting for the Republic later said, quote, "We hated the bourgeoisie. They treated us like animals. When we looked at them, we thought we were looking at the devil himself, and they thought the same of us. There was a hatred between us, a hatred so great that it couldn't have been greater." End quote. The aristocracy hated them right back. One would blame the Civil War on, quote, "modern drainage. Prior to this, the riffraff had been killed by various useful diseases. Now they survived, and of course, were above themselves. When the war is over, we should destroy their sewers. End quote. What a lovely chap. The Catholic Church of Spain remained implacably against any modernisation and allied to the elites. They used the confessional for surveillance, the pulpit for propaganda, and the catechism to damn liberals to hell. Still opposed to, quote, the disastrous mania for thinking, end quote, the clergy sometimes stopped the teaching of reading in schools just to prevent children from being corrupted by Marxist literature. It preached the merits of poverty while the church hierarchy lived in luxury. This rich, hypocritical organisation was loathed in Spain with a ferocity which foreigners found incomprehensible. Whenever there were riots or revolts, the churches were always the first to be burnt down or vandalised. Famously, during an uprising in Barcelona, in a rather macabre spectacle, a worker danced with the body of a disinterred nun while laughing hysterically. That's the level of hatred we are talking about. Spain was stagnant, backward and mired in corruption. All the while, discontent and anger were building up like a pressure cooker. This couldn't go on. Something would eventually have to give. Appropriately enough for this podcast, it will be 3 wars that finally pushed Spain over the edge. The first was the Spanish-American War, which ended in a humiliating defeat and the loss of Cuba, the Philippines, and its remaining imperial possessions. As the Spanish Empire died and the new American Empire was born, the monarchy, army and church had suffered a grievous blow to their prestige. While the Spanish soldiers have fought well, most of their food and equipment have been sold by their officers. The eternal Spain had been revealed as too rotten to even defend the empire it originally built. Trying to recover some lustre, in 1904 Spain split Morocco with France, taking a protectorate in the north, and with it the ferocious Berber tribes of the Rif Mountains. In 1919 those tribes rose in revolt under Abd el-Karim and began slaughtering barely trained, incompetently led conscripts in the thousands. For more information, see my episodes on the Rif War. While eventually victorious, this dirty war in North Africa would have fateful consequences for Spain. I would go so far as to say there wouldn't have been a civil war if they hadn't gone into Morocco. The reason why is that the Rif War transformed the Spanish army. First of all, it led to the creation of Spain's very own Foreign Legion, based on the more famous French force. Despite its name, it was 90% Spanish, and was memorably described by Paul Preston as, quote, a motley band of desperadoes, misfits and outcasts, some tough and ruthless, others simply pathetic, end quote. They were primarily disgruntled, disorientated World War I veterans from both sides, hired killers from Barcelona, fugitives from the law, adventurers, and the hungry off the streets. For good measure, it also included a Russian prince, a Polish count, a circus clown, and a fat former friar seeking penance. That this ragged mob of misfits would become the most feared unit in the army was due to its first leader, that brilliant madman and all-around psychopath, José Milán Estrella. He had been, and would be wounded so many times, eventually losing an arm and an eye, that he became known as the Glorious Mutilated One. Obsessed with death, he called his legionnaires the bridegrooms of death, and their battle cry was Long live death. I bet old Estrella was fun at parties. It seemed to work. They were the spearhead of every offensive, and acted as the special forces of the Spanish army. In doing so, they became notorious for their brutality. They massacred indiscriminately, burned villages and tortured for fun. It says it all that a legionnaire's idea of a gift to a Spanish duchess, who had sent them medical supplies, was a basket of roses containing 2 severed Moroccan heads. We sadly don't know how the Duchess reacted to said gift. It was in the Legion that the future leader of the Nationalists and dictator of Spain, Francisco Franco, got his start. Born in 1892 at the port of Ferrol, the son of a philandering civil servant who he detested and a devout mother who he adored, Franco would have entered the Navy but for its virtual annihilation during the Spanish-American War. Instead, aged 15, he enrolled in the military academy at Toledo. Here, the little matchstick, as he'd been nicknamed, was the smallest of the cadets. He was a frail figure with a high-pitched voice, large ears, and a long Semitic face, which seemed to confirm rumours about Jewish ancestors. When seniors tried to bully him, he responded so fiercely that he soon earned their respect. Sent to Morocco, he became the ablest officer of the whole war, and famed for his almost superhuman bravery. Rising to lead the Foreign Legion, he also became famous for his brutal tactics. He once even commended a bugler for having killed and cut off the ears of an unarmed prisoner. After being seriously wounded in 1916, he survived only by threatening to shoot the doctor, who thought him too far gone to be worth evacuating to hospital. It earned him royal attention and promotion, though. He became the king's favourite general and was even made a gentleman of the bedchamber. We'll leave Franco here for now and return to him later in the episode. Along with the Legion, Spain also created the Army of Africa, made up of Moors in the service of Spain. When the Civil War came, this force would be the best troops on the nationalist side. As well as creating the elite forces that would bring victory for the nationalists, the Rif War greatly influenced the Spanish officers who served there. They became a self-declared elite, suspicious of anyone who threatened their hard-won empire in North Africa. It's telling that when the army rose up, the officers who served in the Rif joined the revolt. Those who hadn't sided with the Republic. With very few exceptions, the split was just that stark. The last conflict to destabilise Spain was World War I. At first glance, it seems an odd choice. Many of you probably already know Spain was neutral throughout the whole war. However, the insatiable Allied appetite for Spain's agricultural exports, raw materials and rising industrial output created what seemed like an economic miracle, with thousands of new enterprises. Spain seemed to finally be industrializing and entering the 20th century. But in 1918 the war ended, and so did the boom. Spain's newly enlarged and unionized industrial workers were suddenly unemployed. They did not take this well. So began the 3 years of Bolshevikism from 1918 to 1920. The Spanish state responded the only way it knew how: bloody repression. In a particularly inventive scheme, one chief of police broke a strike by sending out an army of hitmen to target union leaders. 21 union leaders were shot down, either at home or in the street, in less than 48 hours. The unrest, combined with Spain's worst defeat in the Rif War, led to a coup by General Primo de Rivera. While he liked to compare himself to Italy's Benito Mussolini, he was more an old-fashioned strongman than a fascist. He had some successes, such as winning the Rif War and crushing the strikes. However, in an increasingly polarised society, he was both too liberal and too conservative for the two Spains to tolerate. When Wall Street crashed and the Great Depression hit, he was forced to resign and took the monarchy down with him. At 6 a.m. on April the 14th, 1931, the Second Spanish Republic was declared. As the progressive Spain celebrated, little did they know the Republic wouldn't even last a decade. The countdown to the Civil War had truly begun. The Second Republic raised hopes sky high among the progressive Spain, so high that it couldn't help but disappoint them. Its leaders were moderate liberals who hated the church and the monarchy, but also weren't going to overthrow the whole capitalist and social system. They feared revolution just as much as they feared the reactionary Eternal Spain. Manuel Azaña, who was soon rapidly promoted to Prime Minister, personified this faction. His opponents frequently likened him to a frog, as he was short, balding, and obese from perpetual sweet-eating. with his thick lips, bespectacled eyes, and pendulous jowls. Azania had, according to one observer, quote, the face of a man with few friends, end quote. He's a good press as an intellectual who resisted Franco and fought for liberal democracy. But in 1930s Spain, his middle course won him few friends. On the left, none felt more betrayed than the poor peasants. They had stood up to their landlords and their goons, endured the resulting violence, all in the hopes of land reform. As you approach the polling station, you can see Don Juan, the local landowner, riding a black steed. Around him are his goons armed with clubs, glaring at the peasants as they go to vote. Don Juan languidly brays from his horse. Remember, I am backing the Cedar Party. Only the right represent the true Spain. I would be most displeased if they were not to win here. The smug arrogance on his face causes something to snap inside of you. The anger of a lifetime of living in fear and poverty boiling in your veins. Standing before the Don, you yell out, in my hunger, it is my choice. Don Juan stares down at you like you're something he scraped off his shoe and laughs. Is that so, my little Red? Boys, teach him a lesson. Before the thugs can move a muscle, an old man stands next to you and shouts, I am 65, but have never eaten meat. It's our choice. The crowd begins yelling in support. The Don looks nervous, but one of his goons hasn't read the crowd and strikes the old peasant in the head with his club. As he falls, the peasants surge forward, screaming for revenge. You leap on the lackey and begin pummeling him into the ground. Don Juan flees in terror, leaving his men to their fate. This time you promise yourself, change will come. However, land reform stalled, only implemented on a minuscule scale. Those peasants began turning to the socialists, and especially the anarchists. When we call someone an anarchist these days, it brings to mind someone with purple hair screaming, down with capitalism, while using an iPhone and drinking Starbucks coffee. But Spain was one of the few countries where anarchism truly achieved a mass following. Its appeal was simple. For a peasantry that hated the repressive state, a cruel church, and a horrifically unfair life, smashing down everything deeply appealed. On the ruins they were promised a new paradise rebuilt. Under their red and black flags, the anarchists launched a wave of bank robberies and assassinations. The founder of anarchism, Mikhail Bakunin, had forecast that the millennium would only arrive when the last king had been strangled with the entrails of the last priest, and they took him at his word. As one anarchist leader proclaimed to a cheering crowd, quote, nothing great has ever been achieved without violence. The sins of the old corrupt system can only be washed away in blood. End quote. Things were not looking good for Spain. In the cities, things weren't going much better. The workers and miners tried to seize control of the factories and mines, only to be repressed by the Republic. Anarchism gained a following in industrial Barcelona, while even the small communist movement gained ground among the miners of northern Spain. Azania's liberals were being well and truly outflanked on the left, with the communists sneering that he wanted, quote, a brilliant future in the past, end quote. But if Azania wasn't going far or fast enough for the left, to the right he was literally the Antichrist. He broke the church's hold on education, legalized civil marriage, expropriated Catholic property, suppressed the Jesuits, and even appeared to tolerate the burning of churches. The right never forgave him for his comment that, quote, all the convents in Spain are not worth a single Republican life. End quote. The church responded in kind, with its head snarling mid-sermon, quote, "May the Republic be cursed." End quote. Soon every priest in the land was damning Azania, in between stories of church-burning Reds being struck down by holy vengeance. For the aristocracy, even the Republic's pitiful land reform program was far too extreme. Azania was even trying to get them to actually pay their taxes. What was the world coming to? It was the last faction of the Eternal Spain that was most dangerous to the Republic, the army. In 1931, Spain's forces were corrupt, anachronistic, and top-heavy. Although half the national budget was devoted to the armed services, they possessed almost no modern equipment. They had no tanks, and some of their cavalry regiments had no horses. Their artillery was so obsolete that they had been outgunned by the Moroccans. Most of their rifles were museum pieces, and all their ammunition would have been exhausted by a battle lasting more than 24 hours. With no fighters and only one bomber, its largest bomb weighed a pathetic 11 pounds. Their air force consisted of flimsy reconnaissance planes. Spain boasted 800 generals and an officer corps the same size as that of the German army in 1914. Several thousand soldiers never received uniforms, and many more never received any weapons training. Conscripts were often used as free domestic labour by their own officers. Reform was overdue, but how Azania went about it would come back to haunt him. Azania had pensioned off 2/3 of the officer corps, creating a formidable dissident cadre in the process. He even closed the Saragossa Military Academy, the Spanish Sandhurst or West Point, whose director just so happened to be one Francisco Franco. Although he was the ablest general in the army, Franco also found himself reduced in rank as a result of Azania's reforms, and then he was exiled to a command in the Balearic Islands. The king's favourite general had cannily accepted the new order at first. Azania would come to rue the day he slighted Franco. For now, though, Franco kept his intentions to himself, especially when an old friend proposed a coup. As Spain was racked by violence and strikes, a bizarre incident occurred in the sleepy town of Castilblanco, where 4 civil guard officers had been brutally massacred, seemingly by the whole town. Declaring Spain was on the brink of anarchy, the eccentric General José Sanjurjo launched a coup. Thankfully for the Republic, he was a terrible organizer, and it failed immediately. The Republic was safe for now, but Azania certainly wasn't. He'd antagonized everyone, and they punished him at the ballot box. The right now came to power, thanks to José María Gil Robles, founder and mastermind of the victorious right-wing Cedar Alliance. Gil Robles expressed sympathies for Nazism and liked to be addressed as Jefe, literally boss, in the tradition of Mussolini's Duce and Hitler's Führer. Echoing Italian slogans, one of his electoral mottos was, "All power to the Jefe." It was a sign of how polarized Spain had become that even the supposedly mainstream right was now flirting with fascism. While Robles wasn't allowed to form a government himself, he was powerful enough to start undoing Azania's reforms. In the countryside, all land reform was stopped and actually went into reverse. The aristocracy took its revenge, settling scores with peasants who had defied them. At best, they were forced off their land. At worst, they were murdered. Landlords took to cruelly sneering at their starving peasants that they could, quote, "eat the Republic," end quote. The peasants didn't take this lying down. Really, the countryside was already fighting a civil war before the army rose up. The triumph of the right and the beginning of the so-called 2 Dark Years led to further radicalization on the left. Reactionary triumphalism provoked revolutionary terrorism, strikes, riots, sabotage and murder. Spaniards began arming themselves and drilling. Monarchists in Navarra, Basques in the northwest, anarchists in Catalonia, communists among the mining villages, peasants and landlords in the countryside. Everyone was preparing for battle. As darkness began to fall over Spain, the Socialist Party began to lean closer to communism and turned against the Republic. This was mainly the fault of its leader, Francisco Largo Caballero, who, in his bowler hat, bulging black suit, and lace-up boots, looked like the stolid, pipe-smoking bricklayer and trade union leader he had always been. However, in middle age he caught the revolutionary bug and began to describe himself as the Spanish Lenin. He had none of Lenin's leadership abilities, organisation or intelligence, however. Really, he was play-acting as a revolutionary, his bellicose rantings about class war mainly serving to terrify the middle classes and further polarise Spain. Socialist newspapers started printing charming slogans such as, quote, "Harmony? No! Class war, hatred of the criminal bourgeoisie to the death," end quote. Socialist gunmen stalked the streets, murdering their enemies, whether on the right or just moderate left-wingers. Largo now turned against the Republic, openly boasting that, quote, "Our party is ideologically and tactically a revolutionary party that believes this regime must disappear." The regime he was talking about was the Republic. It had precious few friends now. Stoking fears of fascism, Largo launched what he hoped would be the revolution he dreamt of. However, just like Sanjuro's coup attempt, he turned out to be a poor organiser. Having put in no effort planning-wise, he was rewarded with the revolt being crushed everywhere except in Asturias. Here, though pay was relatively good, conditions underground were even worse than those in Russian mines, and that's really saying something. Socialists, anarchists, communists, and other working-class parties thanked their differences to create a force of some 30,000 men. Although they could not overcome the garrison at Ovidio, they conquered much of the region, making up for their dearth of artillery with explosive charges accurately held by Dynamitrios, skilled at the game of pelota. In the course of this fighting, the church suffered and atrocities took place, much inflated by government propaganda. As Azana had warned Largo Caballero, the revolt invited military repression. Franco was brought back from his exile in the Balearic Islands. Put in command of the Foreign Legion and the Army of Africa, he would crush the miners with pitiless brutality. Flamethrowers, artillery and bombers were all used as the army advanced. Then, having scorched the earth, Franco gave his men leave to rape, loot, mutilate and murder. Here was a foretaste of the colonial methods which Franco would later employ all over Spain. His most notorious henchman at the time was Major Lizardo Doval of the Civil Guard, who was, quote, "determined to exterminate the seeds of revolution even in the bellies of their mothers," end quote. He subjected his victims to such cheerfully named tortures as the tube of laughter, a gauntlet of jeering, beating guards, the concert hall, a variety performance evoking shrieks of torment, and the aeroplane, which jerked prisoners off the ground by their wrists tied behind their backs. Franco tried to conceal these crimes by imposing censorship, while the right-wing press created a smokescreen of atrocity stories about crucified priests and violated nuns. But as a woman who helped to expose the truth observed, quote, "What is happening in Spain is like the delayed explosion of the dark medieval spirit," end quote. The clearer minds on the left saw that the rising had been a terrible disaster, but for the militants, especially Largo, it had produced an intoxicating whiff of revolution. For the right, on the other hand, it seemed to show that the army was the only guarantee against revolutionary change. It confirmed conservatives in their belief that they must do everything possible to prevent what happened in Russia happening in Spain, especially when Largo Caballero declared, quote, "I want a republic without class war, but for that, one class has to disappear." End quote. They did not need to be reminded of the horrors which followed the Russian Revolution and Lenin's determination to annihilate the bourgeoisie. The Asturian Revolt was the first time the two Spains have fought a proper war against one another. It radicalized moderates, eroded what was left of the middle ground, yet there seemed to be a ray of hope for the progressive Spain as the 1936 elections rolled around. The left united into a progressive front to take back power from the right. It seemed as though the centre would hold. However, you only need to look at the apocalyptic language and propaganda during the election to see which way the wind was blowing. Largo, always one to pour gasoline on a fire, declared, quote, "If the right win the elections, we will have to go straight to open civil war," end quote, while socialist posters call for fascists, landlords and capitalists to be strung up. In turn, the right demonized the left. The Bishop of Barcelona declared that, quote, "A vote for the Conservative candidate is a vote for Christ," end quote. Gil Robles plastered Madrid with posters, one of which ludicrously announced that there had been no tuberculosis under the monarchy. Millions of leaflets were distributed claiming that a victory of the left would produce an arming of the mob, the burning of banks and private houses, the division of property and land, looting, and the sharing out of your women. Despite only winning a small majority in the polling booth, the Popular Front won a large majority in the Spanish Parliament. You stare out from behind a curtain with your wife at the vast crowd marching past. As a middle-class business owner, the sight terrifies you to the bone. Smoke hangs heavy in the air from burning buildings. The colour red is everywhere, on the flags of the anarchists and the socialists, but even worse, on the huge number of communist banners that have appeared for the first time. You look at the hammer and sickle so prominently displayed, the pictures of Lenin and Stalin held aloft, and you remember what happened to people like you in Russia when the revolution came. Looking at your family, a shiver runs through your body. No way will that fate happen to them. Your young daughter pipes up, "What does that sign say, Papa?" as she stands on tiptoe to look out the window. "Nothing, dear. Don't worry about it," you say, not wanting to scare her. In big, bold letters it proclaims, "Hang the bourgeoisie. Arm yourselves, workers. The revolution is coming." You hear the front door close and the rush of feet upstairs, and your son Pedro races in. "It's bad outside, Father. They are burning the churches. Father Ramon has been murdered. Now they're heading to the prisons to release all those who revolted back in 34. Our factory is still okay, but for how long I do not know." You shoo your family away from the window and ask Pedro to guard them. Looking outside again, you think, where is the army? Why are they letting this happen? Do none of them have the cojones to act before it's too late? A bizarre phenomenon started of middle-class women marching up to army officers and calling them cowards for not overthrowing the government. One old lady even began beating a general with an umbrella, demanding to know where his cojones or balls were, as the Reds were still in Madrid. Don't mess with the old ladies. Just as the previously weak Communist Party suddenly entered a growth spurt, the same was happening on the right. Fascism had come to Spain. The Falange Española, or Spanish Phalanx, had been born, rather ironically, in the Comedy Theatre in Madrid back in 1933. It was founded by José Antonio Primo de Rivera, the eldest son of the dictator, a young lawyer of dark good looks and slick charm. He attracted a crowd of fascist intellectuals and appealed to students, especially those from wealthy families, the señoritos, as well as many from the lower middle class who felt threatened by social change. Their flag borrowed the anarchist colours of red and black, while their symbols were the yoke of authoritarian government and the arrows of annihilation to wipe out heresy. The perfect Falange member, proclaimed Primo, was, quote, half monk, half soldier, end quote, just like the myth of the crusading knights of the Reconquista. Tiny at first and winning no seats in the 1936 election, its blue-shirted thug soon won a well-deserved reputation for extreme violence. But now their time had come, in that terrible year of 1936. New recruits flowed in, along with money from the terrified rich and Mussolini's fascist Italy. Increasingly heavily armed, the Falange was soon fighting daily street battles with the left and launched a wave of political murders. Their strategy was to provoke violent retaliation from the left, causing such chaos that the army would step in. The left replied in kind, with anarchist and socialist gunmen racking up hundreds of victims. Azaña became Prime Minister again, but he was almost powerless to stop the drift to civil war. The economy tanked, and, as in Weimar Germany, the jobless swelled the ranks of political activists, fatally undermining the stability of the regime. There were parades, strikes, brawls and shootings, lynchings, church burnings, peasant occupation of farms, attempts by commercial interests to subvert the Popular Front, and rumours of conspiracies, coups and revolutions. In Madrid and Barcelona, the sounds of gunfire and bombs going off became a daily serenade. As chaos reigned, another coup plot was slowly moving ahead. This one would be far more dangerous than the first tragicomic effort. The Lion of the Rif, Sanjurjo, was once again its figurehead, but this time the organising was being done by someone far more competent. General Emilio Mola, given the sinister codename of the Director, began preparing the Army of Africa and the Legion for a coup. He also reached out to all forces on the right who despised the Republic. The various monarchist groups buried their differences over which pretender to the throne was legitimate, combining their militias together and agreeing to back a coup. Primo and his Falange met secretly with the army and were happy to kill some Reds. Azaña could feel that conspiracy was afoot and tried to prevent it. He arrested Primo and banned the Falange, but was unable to suppress it. If anything, they became even more violent. He then tried transferring Franco to the Canary Islands and Mola to northwest Spain. This didn't work either. It actually helped the coup. Franco was now conveniently near northern Morocco and the Army of Africa, while Mola had been placed in one of the most royalist areas of Spain, filled with allies. By this point, Azaña was tired and broken. He allowed himself to be elevated to the presidency of Spain, a largely honorific position that gave him a commanding view of, but a spectator's role in, the unfolding Spanish tragedy. It began, he observed, quote, radiant optimism, as the minds of nearly all his countrymen were fired with messianic aspirations. One side was intent on saving Christian civilization, while the other proclaimed the birth of a new civilization. Yet even now the coup might have failed to launch. Mola doubted it would work. Franco was so non-committal that he was mocked by fellow generals as Miss Canary Islands 1936. Then a murder took place that would finally break the camel's back and usher in the Civil War. Gil Robles had given the Cortes a memorable and doubtlessly unreliable inventory of the violence that had taken place under the Popular Front. 269 political murders, 1,287 people wounded, 113 major strikes, 160 churches gutted, 10 newspaper offices destroyed, and so on. At the end of his speech he proclaimed that, quote, Spain is in anarchy, and we are today present at the funeral service of democracy, end quote. Parliament was already in an uproar over this, when the influential conservative Calvo Sotelo rose to speak. Denouncing the Republic, he threatened the government with a military revolt. As fighting almost broke out right there in the chamber, the pale-faced, black-garbed figure of La Pasionaria, the passion flower, the famous communist Dolores Inaruri, allegedly rose and pointing her finger at him intoned, quote, "That was your last speech," end quote. If she really did say this, it was a fateful prediction. As you drive around the city, you've only one thought in mind: revenge. The fascist scum killed Lieutenant Castillo, a friend of yours, and a loyal socialist member of the assault guards. It's time to strike back, and with some like-minded friends and colleagues, you now prowl the streets of Madrid, looking for prominent rightists to kill. Gil Robles was not home, neither was your next target, but your luck seems to have changed at the apartment of Calvo Sotelo. Struggling, he is dragged out by your fellow conspirators and thrown into the police car you're driving. As you drive off down the sleepy streets of Madrid, you all swig from a bottle of brandy in celebration, feeling the pleasant buzz. In the back seat you hear Diego say, "I bet you thought you were untouchable, you fascist pig. None of you can escape the people's justice." Calvo looks back at him with contempt. Your actions, young man, prove that the Reds must be purged from Spain. As they argue, a very young and very drunk socialist in the back, with an almost dreamy look on his face, raises his gun to the back of Calvo's head and pulls the trigger. In the shocked silence that follows, Diego, covered in blood and gore, the drunk young man, still a teen, slyly smiles and says, "One of Castillo's murderers has fallen." Little does he know he has just fired the first shot of the Spanish Civil War. This is really how Calvo Sotelo died. The fact that he'd been killed by state police and the government was then unable to prosecute the assassins finally solidified the right behind the coup. Even the hesitant Franco now fully committed, flying to Spanish Morocco. On the 17th of July 1936, 2 words went out across Spain over the wireless: "Sin Novedad," or "nothing to report." It was the code word for the coup to begin. The 2 Spains were about to fight to the death for the very soul of the nation. Thank you for listening. To help the podcast grow, please like, leave a review, or tell a friend. In the next episode, we'll see how the coup fared and why it turned into a civil war. Hitler, Stalin and Mussolini will start backing the rival Spains, while Franco advances on Madrid. Behind the lines, the Republic experiences revolution and Red Terror, while in the nationalist zone, the generals and the Falange begin purging their opponents. For both sides, their version of Spain can only be built on a river of blood and a mountain of bones. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.